All right, welcome everyone to the August IGRI Research Seminar. My name is Devor Mondam. I'm the coordinator for the IGRI. Before I introduce our speaker for this month and hand over the floor to him, I just wanted to make a quick announcement up at the top regarding the 2024 Conference on Policy Process Research, otherwise known as COPR24. For one, it will be held next May 15th through 17th on the campus of Syracuse University. The call for proposals went out today for that. So if you are interested in presenting at next year's COPR, here I will put the link for the page in the chat where you can go and find the submission information for that if you are interested. Submission will run through October 15th, so you've got plenty of time to do that if you are interested. All right, so that was just a little announcement at the top. I now want to introduce our speaker for this month, Daniel Patton. So Daniel Patton is an environmental protection specialist at NASA. Prior to this, he was a space sustainability fellow at the Secure World Foundation, and he received his master's in natural resources from Virginia Tech. His presentation today is titled Space as a Global Commons, Analysis and Performance. So, Daniel, I yield the floor to you.
Thanks, Devor, and thanks, Saba, for the invitation. Let's see if I can share my screen here. All right, and presentation. Are you all seeing the right screen here, or do I need to switch these?
Yes, we're seeing it.
I'm seeing your presenter mode.
Okay, yeah, let's switch that. Looks like it's doing the same thing here.
Try to go out of this, whatever this is. And then go to slideshow, that tab.
Yeah.
No, all the way up there. Okay, let's see. Then try just hitting from beginning. We'll do it. Oh wait, uncheck use presenter view. It's all the way where monitors is. Yeah, uncheck that. And then now try from beginning.
Okay.
I think you start the slideshow.
All right, are we there now?
Yes.
That's perfect.
Okay, great. It's this dual monitor situation I think I have going on. All right, Sorry for that. Yeah, as Devor said, I'm going to be talking about space as a global commons, and then this talk is sort of in two parts because the first part is space as a commons. I'll talk about um, whether we can define space as a global commons or not, and sort of how we get to that conclusion. Um, and then the latter part, we'll talk about institutional analysis and using institutional grammar as a tool for analysis of the domain and of the institutions that manage it. So let's see. This is a rocket launch that happened 2 days ago, Sunday, in India. Rocket launches happen almost every day now, which is probably, I don't know if you realize that, but the global number of rocket launches is drastically increasing. There's one scheduled later for today at around 8 p.m. If you've never seen one, it's super cool, I hear. I've never actually seen one either, but the point here is that the frequency of rocket launches is drastically increasing, and the domain is that's what's sort of pushing these questions of is it a commons, is it not, how is it going to perform as space becomes more crowded, as the space economy really ramps up. Here's a quick chart I just grabbed off of Wikipedia. This is the global number of rocket launches per year. I love looking at this chart. You can sort of, if you know what you're looking at, you can sort of see the different phases of the space race and space technology. You see it sort of dips off around the late 80s and 90s, and then in the early 2000s, it picks up a lot. Last year, we broke the record for the total number of rocket launches. The year before that, we did it as well. And we're going to break it again this year with the number of planned launches. And when I say we, I mean humanity. I don't mean NASA, because a big part of this increase is actually not state-sponsored launches. It's coming from private partners, from commercial interests, that type of thing. So not only is there a huge increase in number of rocket launches, but the space economy is becoming much more diversified. There are so many more actors in this world than there were before. And it's worth noting that even though we had 179 launches last year, that is not the number of objects launched into space. With the Starlink satellites especially, there are rockets that go up with dozens of payloads. So while it was 179 successful launches, over 2,000 objects were launched into space last year, just to give you an idea of how crowded the orbital domains are becoming. So before we get into if space is a commons, I'll briefly go over what a commons is. This comes from the tragedy of the commons. It's often attributed to William Foster Lloyd, but the basic notion is that there's a shared space, and a number of people are using the resources in that space. As the space becomes more crowded, then individuals have an incentive to add to it at the detriment of the quality or supply in that domain. So the benefit is individual, but the cost is shared among all people equally. So the basic theory is that no one really has an incentive to manage it properly, and that's how you get the tragedy of the commons. So when we talk about what a commons is, there's a lot of different disciplines that use this term, and it means slightly different things. I'm going to focus mostly on economic commons. We're going to use those criteria. The idea of like a legal commons is something else it's related, but I'm not a legal expert, so I'm not going to touch as much on that. But our main criteria for commons designation are rivalry and non-excludability, and we'll get to that in a second as well. I also want to make a distinction between a commons, which might be the domain, and the resources within it. So this distinction is probably clear to most of you here, but I think it's an important one. And the lines can be sort of blurred in space because a lot of times we're not talking about physical resources. We're talking about sort of conceptual or positional resources. So the lines can be sort of blurred there, but I think that distinction is important. So why is this an important question? The proper management of outer space is critical for the continued use of the domain, and there's risks. So as we make the space domain more crowded, then there's risks of Kessler syndrome. That's when the number of satellites increases so much that the chances of collision between any two satellites increases. And once that happens, then a collision happens in space, and it creates a lot of debris, and that debris collides with other satellites, which then collides with other satellites, and you end up with this cloud of debris encompassing the Earth that basically makes it very difficult to launch anything into space. So that's one of the big risks. And then one of the other ones that's coming up more recently is the risk of resource monopolies, especially with discussions of in-situ resource utilization on the moon and on Mars. Those resources are not evenly distributed across the moon or Mars. So they're very localized, and there's potential for resource monopolies there. So there's not a lot of consensus on whether we see space as a commons or not. Various state leaders have said sort of conflicting information. It's not really clear what the global perspective is, although it seems like a lot of space law seems to reinforce the perspective of space as a commons. But there's not a lot of consensus. So our traditional understanding of the commons designation, there's two categories: rivalry and excludability. Rivalry is, of course, meaning like a resource is finite. If it's used by one person, there's less of it for other people. Excludable, just means access can be controlled. So commonly, rivalrous, non-excludable, those are our common pool resources. Non-excludable, non-rivalrous, those are like our public goods, like radio stations. So this is the typical chart you'll see in a lot of like economics textbooks. It's a little bit simplified because when you look at these things, you might, or the different bullets here, you might see that they don't fit super neatly into these categories. And the same thing goes for space. Where would you put space on this chart? And I think it's useful to see this not as a sort of a matrix or chart or table like it's set up now, but more as a continua. So that's sort of what I've done here. I've plotted rivalry and excludability on an X and Y axis, and then we can see not just which category domains fall in or resources fall into. We also see their relative rivalry or their relative excludability. And the same thing can be done with space. Space is a little bit unique though, because it's used for a lot of different things, and different parts of it are used for different things. So, we often refer to space as a single domain, but really it functions more as a series of subdomains. For example, Earth orbit is very different from the moon, which is very different from interplanetary space. They're different in terms of how we use them, but they're also different in terms of how rivalrous they are or how excludable they are. So I think this is one of the things that contributes to this confusion over whether space is a commons or not, is because we talk about domain as a whole when really, there are distinct sections of it that operate very differently. So Earth orbit is probably the one that has the most activity. The thousands of satellites that are in orbit, the tens of thousands of pieces of debris. So it's also used for the most frequently used, I should say. Of course, there's our Earth sensing satellites. We have communication satellites. There's defense activity in orbit. So there's, they don't just function differently, but they also have different levels of crowdedness. They're not all exactly the same. So I think it's important to look at these as subdomains and to see them as distinct. So we can plot these subdomains on the same rivalry and excludability chart here. And here we see that some of our subdomains here, they might not fit very neatly in the common pool resource category here. In theory, the moon is excludable. You could defend the moon like you could defend other territory. So if we say it scores much higher on excludability than something like low Earth orbit, of course it's not owned by anyone. We have agreements that say the moon can't be owned, but if we're looking at it from a the attributes of the moon, it falls more in the private goods section than it does in sort of the common pool resource. Similar to the inverse for like high Earth orbit, which is pretty low rivalry and pretty low excludability, almost like a public good. So when we talk about whether space is a global commons, it's helpful to look at the other things that are commonly referred to as global commons. So Antarctica is one of the classic examples. There's a long history of successful cooperation in Antarctica, and it's a really useful analogy, or at least it has been a really useful analogy for the scientific cooperation that exists in space. Antarctica is mostly used, well, almost is pretty much exclusively used for scientific research. But that analogy sort of falls apart now that space is being seen as more of a commercial domain than just for scientific purposes. The ocean probably has the longest history of agreements and management. I want to draw your attention especially to the deep seabed mineral regime, which is often mentioned in conjunction with in-situ resource utilization on the lunar surface or on the Martian surface. The deep seabed mineral regime, it's sort of the structure in place, if you're familiar with it, that manages the mining of deep sea minerals through a sort of organization that distributes resources from commercial interests to less developed partners in an effort to make the mining of seabed minerals more equitable. So this is sort of lauded as this gold standard of what could happen on the moon. There's also been a lot of criticism around using this analogy because while the deep seabed mineral extraction is possible, it's not really it doesn't happen that often, and this method hasn't really been tested. So there's not a lot of proof of concept here. So it's drawn some criticism for that. The atmospheres are other global commons, commonly referred to as a global commons. The atmosphere is sort of unique in that they're sort of targeted agreements, and that they've taken a very long time to negotiate, even though the science behind climate change has been around for decades, if not centuries. The actual steps to negotiate treaties, international treaties, has taken a very long time. And there's only limited success. The Montreal Protocol is pretty successful in regulating CFCs, but when you look at greenhouse gases and other things like that, they haven't really achieved the same success. The common thread here, though, is that these are all managed by international treaties and agreements, and that is sort of the framework that has been used for space, at least up to this point. So our main space agreements are the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty, I just pulled a couple points from it here. Exploration should be carried out for the benefit and interest of all countries. Province of all mankind, that's a very popular phrase, the province of all mankind, though not exactly certain. No one's really certain exactly what that means. Different people have different interpretations of what those words mean exactly. Outer space shall be free for exploration and use by all states, not subject to national appropriation or claims of sovereignty. Astronauts are envoys of mankind, and states should avoid harmful contamination of space and celestial bodies. So those are sort of like the main points of the Outer Space Treaty. And this is like the main space agreement. There are others. We have these three, the Rescue Agreement, the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention. These all came after the Outer Space Treaty, and they each sort of reinforce separate things that are initially set up in the Outer Space Treaty. The Rescue Agreement protects spaceflight crews by committing states to rescue and warning of hazards. Liability Convention says that nations are liable for damages caused by their rockets and spacecraft. Interesting point there. Liability Convention specifically applies to states. Like it doesn't apply, like in the actual language of the treaty, it doesn't really call out private groups. It calls out nations, which is interesting. You know, people are starting to look at those terms as well to see, you know, how does the supply of, you know, say SpaceX or you know, a Chinese rocket company or something is launching. Registration Convention, that sort of works to buttress the Liability Convention by requiring the reporting of information about satellites or about objects launched into space. It's basically like you have to report the purpose of it and its apogee and its perigee, and all these, you know, its size, that type of thing, so that, you know, you can sort of coordinate and make sure it's not going to affect other projects. So these agreements have been tested very limited, like have very limited testing. You know, they haven't really been tested in the real world. The one major sort of test of the Liability Convention was the Cosmos 954 accident, which happened in 1977. And that saw the failure of a 4-ton Soviet reconnaissance satellite, and it scattered nuclear debris all across northern Canada in the Canadian wilderness. The Canadian government spent months and millions of dollars to clean it up, to track down all these bits of radioactive debris. I think the total cost ended up being somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars. Under the Liability Convention, I think 6 million of that should be reimbursed by the Soviet Union, which after all the negotiations and stuff, that Canada got less than half of that in the end. Which means even though they spent, you know, millions and millions of dollars, they got reimbursed $3 million, which just sort of goes to show that, you know, it's only the success of these treaties is very limited, you know, and it sort of depends on who are the actors involved, you know, which states and what sort of power do they have. You know, that has a huge effect on how successful we see these treaties as. I wanted to mention 2 other things. The Moon Agreement is one that has very few signatories at this point. The United States has not signed the Moon Agreement. Russia has not signed the Moon Agreement. Basically, the Moon Agreement was targeted at the moon, of course. And this last sentence here, all space vehicles, equipment, facilities, stations, and installations on the moon shall be open to other states, parties. A lot of folks see that sort of language as sort of a step too far when it comes to management of the moon, which is probably why, you know, a lot of different countries have not signed it. I also want to mention the Bogota Declaration. This is especially interesting when it comes to the commons discussion. The Bogota Declaration was, I think, 7 equatorial countries who got together and said that segments of geostationary synchronous orbit are part of the territory over which equatorial states exercise their national sovereignty. In other words, satellites in geostationary orbit are stationary above a particular point along the equator. And the nations along the equator said, all right, if your satellite is directly above us and it stays there, like that's our territory. Like we exercise national sovereignty over that. So these handful of countries made this claim. It's been pretty flatly rejected by most other countries, which sort of reinforces the perspective that space is a commons. You know, they're saying it's not a commons, this is our sovereign territory. It's and you know, that's been sort of rejected. Okay, so with all that in mind, you know, we basically end up saying like space it sort of depends on what part of space we're talking about, right? It depends on what part of space we're talking about when it comes to the commons, and it also depends on who agrees on that. It's not just whether it definitionally meets those criteria, but there's also a question of whether are countries going to treat this as a commons or not, and that's sort of where there's confusion. So without a consensus, we can look at the sort of analyze the domain, right? So the first thing I looked to was Ostrom's institutional analysis. Of course, I think you all are familiar with this. But we have these 8 design principles for effective commons management. So what we can do is we can sort of score these space domains against these 8 design principles. And this was sort of my best guess at this, right? The challenge with this is it's really hard to make a consistent judgment for each of these sections. It's hard to sort of quantify these things. So you're just sort of making a judgment call. When I was going through I'm looking at the history of what the international treaties say, but also when these treaties have been tested, how do they stand up? So, basically the takeaway here is that Earth orbit, celestial bodies, interplanetary space, they don't perform very well. Earth orbit is especially fragile, but celestial bodies in interplanetary space are also likely to fail. So the main gaps include sanctions, conflict resolution mechanisms, and nested units. And celestial bodies are probably the resource with the highest risk of poor management because of how limited they are. And that's mostly looking at the potential use. Talked about resource utilization. Mining on the moon or Mars. There's limited space for that, and there seems to be a lot of future demand for those areas. So our challenges with institutional analysis, there's just limited data. We haven't really been in space that long, and we're using space in ways that we haven't used it before. So it's a very dynamic and changing domain. It also holds different resources and has different functions. We could analyze each of them individually and still not get the whole picture here. But there's also a challenge. The increasing activity, it means we have to rely on sort of predictive analysis to reflect the actual risk. We don't know what the space economy is going to look like in 5 years. So to say this is to assess the real risk, we have to sort of try to read the future a little bit, and that's really difficult. But it's mostly just difficult to find a reliable and replicable analysis method for institutional analysis. I don't think institutional, Ostrom's institutional analysis was really geared towards a domain like space, although it's certainly been applied before. So this is when I started looking at institutional grammar to look at the institutions that are in place, the space treaties that we mentioned before. But we had to first ask, like, do these treaties, do they meet the qualifications for analysis? What sort of institutions are they? Are we analyzing the effectiveness or the state of the institutions? Are we doing descriptive or diagnostic analysis? And there's also this thing in a lot of international treaties where there's statements that are not exactly regulatory. There's statements that are sort of about, they're saying, space is this. It's a statement of like a shared value, right? We see space this way, which isn't really a regulatory statement, but it is setting sort of the groundwork for regulatory statements. But it's not really constitutive statement either, because it is making a claim. It's setting a sort of a standard in the way we operate in that domain. I'm sure many of you have seen this this figure. This was like, I saw this in this paper and was like, everything sort of clicked at once. It's like one of these great moments. So thank you, Saba, for this chart. You and your colleagues, especially this lower portion here, where we talk where strategies, norms, and rules is sort of set out like that. Basically, for my analysis, I did a very limited look at these space treaties. They are laws, so that they're institutions in form, if we're looking at the treaties themselves. And I'm trying to look at just the institutional statements in those, and then sort of parse the syntax there to figure out sort of what are the gaps. So here's sort of two examples from the Outer Space Treaty. This is Article 1, says the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit in the interest of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind. All right, it's hard to say like what is there's a really regulated in this sentence. This is just sort of a statement of value, a statement of like this is the way we see space. As it goes on, Article 5 is another great one. In carrying on, I think that was supposed to be out, activities in outer space, non-celestial bodies, the astronauts of one party shall render all possible assistance to astronauts, other states' parties. Okay, it's a great statement, but there's no or else here. And if you look through all of the treaties, none of them have or else statements. They're all missing that. So when we look at this chart, right, we have targets, we have attribute, we have aim, we have object, condition, deontic, but there's no or else statements really anywhere. There's sort of an implicit structure for resolving conflicts between states, but it's not spelled out in the actual institutional statements of those treaties, which means while we call these laws, really they're effectively norms when it comes, and that's sort of proven by the Cosmos 954 accident, right? Like, according to the Liability Convention, they should reimburse exactly this much, right? And that didn't happen, and they didn't, and there was no penalty for that, right? There's no or else statements here. Okay, so sort of our conclusions with our institutional analysis is one, there's no reliable methodology for institutional analysis of space domains, and qualitative estimations appear to show that management is really broad. It's the domain as a whole, and performance is relatively fragile. In our institutional grammar analysis reveals that the unique and challenging language of space institutions, that there's a lack of or else statements that show space acts more as norms than rules. So these things both create sort of like a vulnerability to sustainability, especially in an accelerating space economy. So that's sort of where things stand right now. So what are our potential management strategies? We could try to meet those deficiencies identified in the institutional analysis, have more graduated sanctions, conflict resolution mechanisms, nested units. We could strengthen space law to include more or else statements. We'd also address each space domain or resource separately, as is more commonly done with the oceans and the atmosphere. But there's also a big opportunity to explore novel governance concepts. I mentioned that last one especially because I've been having some discussions with other space policy people, and looking into some of the UN archives about the negotiations of these treaties that we examine. And we really see that these lack of enforcement measures in space law, it wasn't accidental, like it wasn't an oversight, right? In negotiating these treaties, like this type of language is left out on purpose because it's the only way to get people to sign it. So furthermore, these agreed upon principles, they don't imply uniform application. Just because all these states have signed it, there is still wide power differences between states and parties. meaning that even though they all signed to the same treaty, they're not necessarily applied the same way. And the last challenge here is participation is voluntary. There's nothing that says every state has to sign whatever agreement. We saw that with the Moon Agreement because almost nobody signed it. No one had to. So this is where we see sort of the emergence of a sort of a different approach to governing space. And it's not really governing, it's the role of non-treaty agreements, these multilateral agreements that are coming into play. So the big one that you've probably heard of is the Artemis Accords. But the purpose of these agreements, they act as incentives instead of penalties, right? If you sign on to this, you can have you can cooperate with us in this mission. You can have a certain amount of access to this technology or this research, or if we set up a base to mine stuff on the moon, you can be in our group or whatever. So it acts as an incentive instead of a penalty, but there's still there's still rules that go along with that. They still have to agree to certain operational parameters. So that's sort of the new thing that's being explored. Of course, it hasn't really been tested yet either. We've had one Artemis rocket launch last year that didn't touch down on the lunar surface, but with the anticipated activity in the future, this is sort of the new test for whether this is going to be an effective management strategy. So this isn't to say that there's abandonment of the existing treaties, but it's to add additional principles for operations on the moon, especially for the Artemis Accords. But if it's really successful, then who knows? There might be other opportunities. With that, I think I've taken up like 40 minutes, maybe 30 something. So I'd love to open it up to questions and discussion. I won't go back into. I can go back into some of this if you want. If there's anything I can clarify, just let me know. Oh, conclusions. I forgot this slide. This is basically what I just said. The space is not a uniform domain. Some are definitional commons, other may be managed as commons. Our analysis shows fragile performance, and there's challenges in international law, but we have some potential strategies in mirroring terrestrial domains, and new agreements and novel governance concepts. So that I'll go open questions.
Thanks so much, Daniel. I learned so much in this lecture. I basically knew zero about this topic. Well, I have a lot of questions, but they're kind of very general context questions, just reflecting my sort of lack of understanding in this domain. But I guess one of the questions I have is like, what patterns did you expect to see? So given your own understanding of this domain and kind of your experience, I mean, with respect to at least, some of the commons, some of this particular space commons that you were referencing and some of the particular policies, I mean, were you expecting to see particular governance features or governance arrangements that you either ended up seeing or didn't see?
Well, I don't know. This probably speaks more to my, naivete in this world than anything else. But when I started, I sort of had really high expectations. Well, I had no expectations at the start, and then as soon as I got into it, I was like, "Oh, we have all these space agreements. Surely they are robust and effective management mechanisms." And then was sort of surprised to see that they weren't. But that sort of makes a lot of sense because you look into the history of how these things were negotiated. A lot of these treaties started to be negotiated in like the 60s, right when the space race was taking off. And there's a lot of discussion around how is space going to be used. There's a lot of fear around whether space was going to be used as sort of or military operations. That was the main concern. Because a lot of the early research was in that world. So the outer space treaty is sort of lumped with these other disarmament or anti-armament treaties that happened around the same time. It was just basically saying, hey, you can use this, but let's try to use it for peaceful purposes. Let's not all put all of our nuclear warheads in orbit. So that was sort of the main agreement behind it, and then that was really successful. No one really did that, and then but now we're sort of dealing with these I don't know, these old agreements that are not really geared towards current operations. Like I was saying with the Liability Convention, it's only really talking to states. It's not talking to private companies, and there's some disagreement over whether a private company would even be subject to that. If a SpaceX rocket or Blue Origin rocket or whatever fell on Canada, who would they be responsible, or is the United States responsible? Is the United States responsible, and they'll pass that down to the private companies? And if so, how is that going to be done? So these treaties aren't really, they've sort of they're not equipped to deal with the current commercial part of space, or even the other aspects of telecommunications, defense. There's lots of ways we use space now that that really weren't anticipated when the treaties were written.
And then I had one comment regarding your or else. So, one of the things that we observed ourselves when we were doing the coding was like we were never finding or else's. And this is something that we've tried to resolve in the IG 2.0, the Institutional Grammar 2.0, the new version where we sort of reconceptualized or else, because we realize it doesn't show up, but I think it doesn't show up because it's not actually a syntactic component. It's like its own kind of statement that implies like an enforcement or a sanctioning action. So we've sort of rethought about how to capture that for exactly kind of the reason that you point out, which is like if you try to capture them as a syntactic element, you just won't find them.
Yeah. So how does that work with, there's sort of these, I mean, at least with space law, I think of it as like the or else statements are sort of implied. Like if you don't like, there's this structure, but like you're saying, it's not a syntactic element. Like how do you analyze that or incorporate that into a syntactic analysis?
Yeah, well, in some ways sometimes it's like making an implicit statement or inferring parts of statements and kind of just noting that in the coding somehow. So like in my own coding, like I'll include it in brackets so I know that this is an implicit. This is implicit as opposed to explicitly identified, like in the legislation, since I'm often looking at legislation or regulation policy documents. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that's the other piece is like sometimes these policies have preambles or some other kind of clause or provision embedded somewhere that indicate there are some blanket sanctions or, based just on your context knowledge, that there are some enforcement mechanisms there. And then it becomes about how to like capture that so that in your analysis, you have it to reference. So I think so just inferring it and then writing it out as a part of a statement or as a statement.
Yeah. I think about this a lot with, my day job is on like the environmental compliance side. I would think there's like all these environmental laws that function the same way.
Yeah.
Especially in like the federal government, like NEPA rules are, NEPA is this process we have to go through. But there's no regulatory body that ensures compliance with that. And so like the risk, or I guess like not the risk, the or else is, or else you might get sued. It's sort of like, and it's not even a structural thing. It's if you're in violation of this, then it's not even the government. It's not even an agency that will assure compliance. It's sort of relying on external groups or interests to you know, to make sure you're actually doing that, which is a
Mhm.
really interesting setup.
Right.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks a lot for the fantastic presentation. Yeah, I think it's really a new space and worth further explore, as I'm really interested in your studies. And I want to ask a question: what's the difference between the agreements for the space and other, international commons such as climate change?
Yeah. So the differences between sort of space agreements and other commons agreements. Well, I think one of the main things is the space agreements are not really targeted in the same way that other agreements are. Um, you know, especially if you look at like climate change or look at the atmosphere, I guess, you have agreements that are sort of targeted towards specific things like the Montreal Protocol or the Paris Agreement. And there's a whole list of them, and it even gets more specific than that. Um, Space is not even like the most specific agreement we have is the Moon Agreement, and then no one signed the Moon Agreement, you know? So all we have these agreements that are basically just space generally, and they're so broad that it's really hard to have effective management. So it's useful to think about it in some ways as a single domain because they're unified by this single method of access. You launch rockets, like they're unified through the access method, but outside of that, like very different uses and functions. So I think that's the main difference, and that's I'm not sure. I'm not sure the best way to resolve that if it is to make more targeted agreements. But it seems like that's not effective based on the Moon Agreement, you know?
Yeah, go ahead, Lozandra.
Hi, Daniel. Congratulations for the presentation. Through the last decades, we have seen the states involving in the space issue. Soviet Union, United States, China, India, European Commission. But recently, we are seeing private companies involving in the space deal with. How the agreements involve control the private companies or the people specifically in this big context.
Yeah, I would say I think it's a great question, and thanks for asking it. I think there's I think most of the existing language is pretty silent on commercial actors and non-governmental groups. And that goes back to, how they were written. They were written, in the 60s when the only people who were really capable of space flight were the most powerful countries in the world. Now that space technology is much more, I don't know if you can say ubiquitous, but it's much more common and accessible. Now, there's all these new actors in space. I mean, if you in the 60s, if you said that India was going to launch a rocket every couple weeks, no one would believe you. So they're because the space economy has changed so much, a lot of the language is pretty silent. I think there is regulation, but it happens on the state level. So there's a lot of in the United States, it's the FAA, and then I'm sure there's other equivalents that sort of manage those space requirements. So dealing with certain permits, that type of thing. But those vary on a country by country basis, and it's not really in the language of the international treaties.
Because this also involves another bureaucratic structure. Because if you're dealing with states we have, of course, the international affairs or secretary of international affairs. But when we're dealing with companies, you have also think another, I don't know, bureaucratic institution to deal with, to
Yeah.
regulate, to
Yeah, exactly. And I was recently at a workshop where we talking about this specific thing, talking about sort of government and non-government interactions when it comes to space. And one of the things I heard is that a lot of private companies are asking for the regulation. They want to know, what can we do, what can we not do? And we sort of think of it the other way, where it's like that they don't want any regulation, but no, we want to make sure, just tell us what the rules are so we can follow them, because they don't want to start doing something and then this reactionary approach to say, oh no, you can't do that, and now you have to change your plans. They want to be able to plan just like anyone else does. So yeah, I think there's some opportunity there to decide how those partners operate, and or how those parties operate, and come up with a strategy for it.
Anyone with any other questions for Daniel?
Well, I'd be curious to know where you're going next with this.
Yeah, I would love to look more into the commercial side of things. I think that'd be really interesting to see, where things go. I think there's a lot of research to do. I could definitely get more into the institutional grammar stuff. This is, you could probably tell this is the newest part of it for me. I spent the fellowship mostly looking at the common stuff, so the grammar is newer for me. But I have found it to be a very helpful tool in understanding the institution. So yeah, that's basically where it is right now. I'm an independent researcher right now. I did this fellowship last year, but I've also recently started a doctoral program that's in a separate subject. So my time dedicated to space policy research is probably not going to be as much as it has been last year, but we'll see.
Which subject is that?
Sorry?
Which subject?
Environmental engineering. So it's I'm going to be looking at PFAS in aerospace applications. So sort of a different world entirely. Also interesting stuff.
Great. Super.
All right. Well, on that note, we will wrap up the seminar. So thank you to Daniel for coming on and giving your presentation. And thank you to everyone for coming and listening and asking questions. And we'll see folks next month.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Daniel.
Bye. Thank you again, Daniel.
Bye.